Elizabeth Monroe did not cry when her husband told her he had never loved her. She simply stood at that supper table, pressed her hands flat against the wood to stop them from shaking, and made the only decision she had left. That night, she walked out of Whitaker Hall with one bag and 15 years of silence on her back and never looked back. If you want to know whether a woman like that ever came home, and whether he deserved it when she did stay until the end, subscribe to our channel and drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. Virginia summer, 1816. The heat had not broken by nightfall. It rarely did that time of year, when the air sat heavy over the fields like a wool blanket soaked through, and even the crickets seemed too worn out to sing with any real conviction. The candles inside Whitaker Hall burned low. The house was quiet, and Elizabeth Monroe Whitaker stood in the center of the master bedroom, with her husband's words still ringing in her ears like the aftermath of a gunshot. "I respect you. I have always respected you. But if you are asking me whether I have ever loved you, truly loved you, then I owe you the honesty of saying no. I have not." That surprised her. Later, when she had the distance to think about it, she had expected to cry. 15 years of marriage, and she had expected at least that much, the release of it, the physical proof that something real was ending. But her eyes stayed dry, her hands stayed steady, and what she felt, standing in that room while Thomas Whitaker looked at her with that careful, measured expression he always wore when he believed he was being noble, was not heartbreak, it was recognition. She recognized the moment. She had been circling it for years. Thomas had not intended it as cruelty. That was the most important thing to understand about Thomas Whitaker. And also, in many ways, the most damning. He was not a cruel man. He was not a dishonest man. He was a man who had built his entire life around a particular understanding of duty. And in his mind, duty and love were so thoroughly intertwined that he had never once questioned whether they were the same thing. He had married Elizabeth Monroe when she was 19 and he was 26. Because her father was a good man who had fallen on hard times. Because Elizabeth herself had impressed him with her composure and her intelligence. And because marriage at that stage of his life had seemed like the correct next step. He had provided for her. He had been faithful to her. He had given her a fine house and good land, and a position in Harlow County society that her own family could never have afforded her. He had believed, in the straightforward way, that certain men believe things without ever examining them. That this constituted love. The argument, if it could even be called, that had started over something small. It always started over something small with them, because the large things were never spoken of directly. Elizabeth had asked him quietly, over supper, why he had not mentioned to her that he planned to sell the eastern pasture to the Hargrove family. It was land she had managed, land she had negotiated the grazing contracts on. Land where she had spent 3 summers coaxing a depleted soil back into usefulness. It was a business decision, Thomas said. I did not think it required a consultation. It required a conversation, Elizabeth said. There is a difference. He had looked at her the way he always looked at her when he felt she was being unreasonable patient. Slightly withdrawn, as though he were waiting for the moment to pass. Elizabeth, you manage the household. The land decisions are mine. I manage considerably more than the household. Thomas, and I think you know that. The silence between them had stretched. And then, in a moment she would replay in her mind for a long time afterward. She had asked him the question she had been holding back for years. She did not even fully plan to ask it. It came out of her the way certain true things do not chosen. Exactly, but inevitable. Do you love me, Thomas? Not the idea of a wife. Not the woman who keeps this house. Me, Elizabeth. Do you love me? He had paused. She would remember that pause. The way he set down his fork. The way he seemed to genuinely consider the question. As though it deserved careful thought rather than an immediate answer. And then he had said it. I respect you. I have always respected you. But if you are asking me whether I have ever loved you, truly loved you, then I owe you the honesty of saying no. I have not. He said it the way he might have reported a crop yield. Clearly, without flinching, as though honesty in that particular moment was a virtue he was extending to her. A courtesy she ought to be grateful for. Elizabeth had nodded once. She had folded her napkin and placed it beside her plate. And she had excused herself from the table. She packed lightly. One traveling bag, a change of clothes, her mother's Bible. The small amount of pin money she had saved over the years in a tin she kept at the back of the wardrobe. She moved through the room efficiently, without hesitation. The way she moved through everything, with the focused economy of a woman who had learned early that wasted motion was a luxury she could not afford. Thomas came to the doorway when he heard her moving around. "What are you doing?" he said. A pause. "Elizabeth, I answered your question honestly. I thought that was what you wanted." She did not look up from the bag. "You did answer honestly. I'm grateful for that. Then I don't understand why you're—" "Because I have been building a life with a man who does not love me," she said. Still not looking at him, still folding things with that same careful precision. "And I have told myself for a long time that it was enough. That respect was enough. That a good house and a good name and a good position were enough." She looked up at him then. Her eyes were dry and very clear. "They are not enough. Thomas, I am sorry it took me this long to say so. You cannot leave," he said it without force. Almost confused, as though the notion had not occurred to him as a real possibility. "This is your home. This is your house," she said. "My home is wherever I decide it is, Elizabeth." There was something shifting in his face now, not quite alarm. Not quite feeling, but the early edge of something he didn't have a name for yet. "Where do you intend to go?" "My Aunt Clara's farm." "It's 11 miles. I've walked farther. You cannot walk 11 miles in the dark. Then I'll walk in the moonlight." She lifted the bag. "Goodbye, Thomas." He stepped into the room then, not to stop her. Not physically, but as though the space between them had suddenly become too wide, and he was trying to recalculate it. "This is Elizabeth. This is a dramatic reaction to an honest answer. I thought you would want. What did you think I would want?" She turned. Her voice was very quiet. When Elizabeth Monroe was at her most serious, her voice always got quieter. The women in her family were like that. "You thought I would want to know that the man I have given 15 years of my life to, the man I have cooked for and managed this estate for and sat beside and built a life with, you thought I would want to know that he has never, in all that time, loved me? And you thought knowing that would be enough? That I would thank you for the honesty and go to sleep?" Thomas opened his mouth. "Don't," she said. "Please don't say whatever you were about to say. You've been honest enough tonight." She walked past him. Down the hall, down the stairs, and out the front door of Whitaker Hall into the thick Virginia dark. Thomas stood in the bedroom doorway for a long moment after she left. He heard the front door close, not slam, which somehow made it worse, and he stood there with a strange feeling working through him that he could not immediately identify. He went to the window. He could see her figure moving down the long drive. Unhurried, the bag in her hand, her back straight. He told himself she would turn around. She did not turn around. He told himself she would be back by morning, that she would go as far as the Hendersons' place up the road. Or perhaps not even that far, and she would realize that whatever point she was making had been made and come back. That was how these things went. He had seen it with his neighbors, with his cousins. Women made their statements. Things were unsettled for a day or two. Then life resumed. He went back to bed. It took him a long time to sleep. Elizabeth walked the 11 miles to her Aunt Clara's farm in a little over 2 hours and a half. The moon was up and nearly full, which helped. The road was familiar. She had ridden it dozens of times on horseback, and the walking itself was almost a relief. The physical motion of it, the way her feet on the hard-packed dirt gave her something to focus on besides the particular ache that had settled into her chest. She had loved him. She wanted to be clear about that. At least to herself, in the privacy of a moonlit Virginia road. She had loved Thomas Whitaker, not blindly, not without reservation. Not without the kind of sober understanding of his flaws that 15 years of close proximity tends to produce. But she had loved him, the deliberateness of him. The steadiness, the way he could be relied upon to do what he said he would do. She had built something real on that foundation, or tried to. What she had not understood for a long time was that a foundation alone is not a home. Aunt Clara's farm appeared out of the dark around 2 a.m, the familiar outline of the house. The smell of the livestock, the sound of a dog starting up and then settling when it recognized her step on the path. Elizabeth knocked softly. There was a pause, and then candlelight behind the curtain. And then the door opened and Clara Whitfield, 62 years old, sharp-eyed, sharp-tongued, and deeply unsurprisable, looked at her niece standing on the step with a traveling bag and said, "Well, come in then. I'll put the kettle on." Elizabeth sat at the kitchen table while her aunt moved around the small, warm room, and for the first time since Thomas had spoken those words across the supper table, she felt something loosen in her chest, not fixed. But not better. "Did he hurt you?" Clara asked. Direct, as always. "Not in any way that leaves a mark," Elizabeth said. Clara set the kettle on. "What did he do?" "He told me the pause. He said he's never loved me." Clara was quiet for a moment. She turned and looked at her niece steadily. "And you believed him? He's never lied to me before." "No." Clara sat down across from her. "No, I don't suppose he has." She reached out and put her hand over Elizabeth's. "You going to be all right?" Elizabeth thought about it honestly. "Eventually, she think I am." In the morning, Harlow County began to talk. It was not immediate. These things rarely were. But by the second day, after Elizabeth Whitaker had walked out of her husband's house in the middle of the night, the story had started its particular journey through the county, in the way that stories in small Virginia communities always did, moving from farm to farmhouse, to dry goods store to church porch, gaining weight and detail and embellishment at each stop. The early versions were sympathetic to Thomas, largely because Thomas was rich and the rich in Harlow County were generally afforded sympathy as a matter of social reflex. Mabel Forsythe told her sister that she'd always suspected Elizabeth Monroe had too much pride for her own good. Old Judge Reeves said at the barber shop that a man like Thomas Whitaker didn't take a wife to be questioned about his business dealings. And that if Elizabeth didn't understand that, she'd misunderstood the nature of the arrangement from the start. But there were other voices too, smaller ones, quieter. Martha Gideon, who ran the milliner's shop on Calhoun Street and had known Elizabeth since childhood, said flatly that Thomas Whitaker had always taken that woman for granted, and anyone with eyes could see it. The Reverend Pierce's wife said nothing publicly, but was observed to bring a ham and a basket of vegetables out to Clara Whitfield's farm on the third day. And everyone understood what that meant. Thomas, for his part, said nothing. He had gone back to work the morning after Elizabeth left, which most of Harlow County interpreted as confirmation that he was not particularly troubled by her departure, and which was both accurate and inaccurate at the same time, in the complicated way that true things often are. He was not, in fact, untroubled. He discovered this in increments over the first 2 weeks after she left, in ways that he had not anticipated and that he found confusing, which was the closest word he had for it. He was a man accustomed to managing his confusion privately and efficiently. And so he managed this the same way, by moving through his days and taking careful note of what was wrong. The household was wrong. That was the first thing. Elizabeth had, over the course of 15 years, constructed an intricate and largely invisible system for running Whitaker Hall, the scheduling of the household staff, the management of the pantry and the linen and the garden, the correspondence with tradespeople and neighbors, The management of certain estate accounts she had quietly taken over from the previous steward, after demonstrating she could handle them with more accuracy and less waste. Thomas had known she managed these things in a general way. He had not known she managed them so thoroughly that without her, they began almost immediately to come slightly undone. Mrs. Porter, the cook, came to him on the third morning with a list of provisions that needed ordering, and a question about whether the Tuesday market and in Harlow would do, or whether she should send a boy to the Richmond merchant. Because Mrs. Whitaker had always handled that, and she didn't know the arrangement. Thomas looked at the list and felt briefly, sharply lost. He sent Mrs. Porter away and wrote Elizabeth a letter asking her to provide instructions for the household accounts. The letter came back unopened. Enclosed was a note in Elizabeth's handwriting. "I am confident you will manage." He stared at that note for a long time. On the 6th day, one of the field hands, a quiet man named Joseph, who had worked the Whitaker land for 8 years, came to him with a problem about the northern fence line where the Hargrove boundary met the Old Creek Road. The Hargroves were disputing 3 rods of it, Joseph explained. Mrs. Whitaker had been managing the correspondence on it, along with the surveyor's report she'd commissioned in the spring. Thomas did not know about the surveyor's report. He had not known Elizabeth had commissioned it. He rode out to look at the fence line and came back with a headache and the uncomfortable knowledge that his wife had been quietly, competently handling a property dispute he hadn't even been aware of. On the 9th day he found the garden. He knew in an abstract way that Elizabeth kept a kitchen garden. He had seen her working in it from time to time, from the window of his study, but he had never given it much attention. It was, he had assumed, the kind of occupation a woman of her station took up for gentle amusement. He walked through it that morning, looking for one of the housemaids, and found himself stopping. It was not a casual garden. Row upon row of vegetables in the kind of careful order that required planning and sustained effort: beans, squash, turnips, carrots, herbs in a separate section near the stone wall. Stakes and ties everywhere, neat and systematic, notes on small wooden markers he had to crouch down to read. Dates, varieties, observations about soil and yield. In the corner, a small cold frame he hadn't noticed before, protecting seedlings for a second planting. He stood in the middle of Elizabeth's garden for a while and felt something he could not name pressing at the edges of his chest. He went to see her on the 14th day. He told himself he was going because of practical matters, the household accounts, the fence line dispute, several other things that genuinely required her input. He rode out to Clara Whitfield's farm in the middle of the morning, tied his horse at the post, and knocked at the door. Clara opened it. She looked at him the way she had always looked at him, with the measuring expression of a woman who had formed a firm opinion a long time ago and was willing to allow additional evidence. "Thomas Whitaker," she said. "What do you want?" "I'd like to speak to Elizabeth," he said. "If she's willing. Then I'll go." He paused. "I'd like her to know I'm asking, though, not demanding." Asking. Clara looked at him for another moment, then stepped back. "Wait here." She was gone for several minutes. He stood on the porch and looked out at the Whitfield fields, smaller than his. Older, the fence posts weathered to gray. He could hear Clara's and Elizabeth's voices inside, too low to make out words. Then Clara reappeared. "She'll speak to you." Out here, she held the door for him. "I'll be inside." Within earshot, Elizabeth came out onto the porch. She had been working. There was flour on her cuffs, and her hair was pinned up simply, without the care she usually took with it at Whitaker Hall. She looked different here, not diminished, something closer to the opposite of that. "Thomas," she said. She did not say it warmly, but she said it without hostility either. She sat down in one of the porch chairs and gestured at the other one. "Sit if you like." He sat. He had prepared things to say on the ride over. They seemed now poorly suited to the moment, he said. "How are you?" "I'm well," she said. "I've been helping Aunt Clara with the preserving." The beans came in heavy this year. Good, he said. That's good. A pause. The household as I've been managing the household, I imagined you would, she said. It's more complicated than I realized. Something moved in her face, not quite a smile. Not quite bitterness. It is. The fence line dispute with the Hargroves. Joseph tells me you commissioned a surveyor's report. In February. The report is in the top left drawer of the writing desk in my sitting room. The surveyor's name and address are on the cover. You'll want to write to him directly. He can appear before the county magistrate if it comes to that. And it likely will. He's reliable. I checked his references myself. Thomas looked at her. Elizabeth, why didn't you tell me about the dispute? She met his eyes steadily. I told you about it twice last year. You told me to handle it. He didn't remember that. He wanted to say he didn't remember it, and something stopped him, the recognition. Dim but persistent, that not remembering not the same thing as it not having happened. I see, he said. The quiet between them stretched. A mockingbird somewhere in the yard went through its repertoire 3 different songs in quick succession before it got bored and stopped. Thomas, Elizabeth said at last. Why did you really come here? He opened his mouth. Closed it. Tried again, I told you. The household accounts. Those are reasons, she said. They are not why you came. He looked at her. And for perhaps the first time in 15 years, he said something to Elizabeth Monroe Whitaker without calculating at first. I don't know, he said. I don't know why I came. I only know that I needed to. Elizabeth looked at him for a long moment. Her expression was careful and sad and clear. That's honest, she said. I'll give you that. She stood up from her chair. The conversation apparently was over. The surveyor's report is in the left drawer, she said again. The Hargroves won't have a legal leg to stand on if you take it to the magistrate. Don't let them pressure you into a settlement before you've spoken to him. Elizabeth, goodbye. Thomas, she went inside. The screen door closed gently behind her. He rode home the long way, through the lower fields where the corn was coming in tall and green, and the air smelled of summer and turned earth. The heat was full up by mid-morning. He rode slowly. And he thought about the look on her face when he'd said, I don't know why I came. I only know that I needed to. It was the most honest thing he had said to her in 15 years. He thought about that for a long time. Back at Clara Whitfield's farm, Elizabeth stood at the kitchen window and watched Thomas Whitaker ride away down the lane. Her aunt appeared at her elbow with a cup of tea. Well, Clara said. He's confused, Elizabeth said. He ought to be. He's used to understanding everything, Elizabeth said. He doesn't know what to do with a thing he can't make sense of. Is that sympathy I hear? Elizabeth was quiet for a moment. Understanding, she said at last. Not the same thing. She took the tea from her aunt's hands. He'll have to figure it out himself. I can't do it for him. I've been doing things for him for 15 years. That's half the problem. Clara's made a sound that was neither agreement nor disagreement, the sound of an older woman who had seen enough of life to know that things rarely resolve the way you wanted them to, or the way they should, and that the most you could generally hope for was that they resolved honestly. What are you going to do? She asked. Elizabeth wrapped both hands around the warm cup. Outside, the last trace of dust from Thomas's horse settled back onto the lane. I'm going to finish the preserving, she said, and then I'm going to think about what I want. For myself, not for him, not for the estate, not for Harlow County's opinion of me. She paused. That might take some time. I haven't done it in a while. Clara put a hand briefly on her shoulder. Take all the time you need, she said. The beans'll keep. The morning after Thomas rode back from Clara Whitfield's farm, he woke up before dawn and lay in the dark for a long time, staring at the ceiling of a room that felt, for the first time in his memory, too large. He got up. He dressed himself. He went downstairs. Mrs. Porter had not yet come in from her cottage behind the kitchen garden, and the house was entirely still in the way that houses are still when they are genuinely empty, not merely quiet. Thomas had lived in this house his whole life, had been born in it, had grown up in it, had inherited it at 23 when his father died. He knew every board that creaked and every window that stuck in the summer heat. He had never, in all those years, found the stillness uncomfortable. He found it uncomfortable now. He went to the kitchen and built the fire himself, which he had not done since he was a boy, and set the coffee on, and stood there waiting for it in the growing light, and tried to identify what was wrong with the silence. It took him longer than it should have. Then he understood. There was no sound of Elizabeth, no soft footstep on the floor above him, no movement in the sitting room across the hall, where she sometimes went early in the morning when she couldn't sleep. No sound of the back door opening and closing when she went out to check the kitchen garden before breakfast. He poured his coffee and stood there drinking it alone, and understood, in a way he had not understood anything in a long time, that a person can be the sound of a house without anyone noticing until the sound is gone. He was still standing there when Joseph knocked at the back door. "Sorry to come early, Mr. Whitaker," Joseph said, hat in hand. He was a careful man, Joseph measured in his speech, deliberate in everything. He had worked the Whitaker land longer than any of the other hands, and he was the only one of them who had ever spoken to Elizabeth as an equal rather than an employer. "Got a problem with the Miller Creek pasture, thought you ought to know about. The South Bank's giving way." "How?" Thomas said. "Bad enough that we'll lose the fence before month's end if we don't shore it up. Mrs. Whitaker had spoken to me back in April. About it, she'd arranged for the Kendall brothers from over Calhoun way to come do the work. They was supposed to come in June." He paused. "I don't know whether she's told them not to come, or whether they're still expecting to." Thomas looked at him. "She arranged that in April?" "Yes, sir. She'd noticed the erosion last fall. Kept an eye on it through winter." Another pause. "She kept notes on most things." He reached into his coat and produced a small folded paper. "I found this in the equipment shed. She left it there for me. It's got the Kendall brothers' address on it and some instructions." Thomas took the paper. He unfolded it. Elizabeth's handwriting covered both sides small, precise, utterly legible. Instructions for the bank repair. Materials needed. Timeline, the Kendall brothers' rates, which she had already negotiated. A note at the bottom in her hand. "Joseph knows the site best. Trust his judgment on depth." Thomas read it twice. "She wrote this before she left," he said. "Yes, sir. I think she wrote several of them. There's one in the tack room about the 2 mares that are due to foal in August. And I believe Mrs. Porter has one about the kitchen accounts." Joseph held his hat and looked at Thomas with the careful expression of a man choosing his words. "She planned ahead, Mr. Whitaker. Even when she was leaving, she planned ahead for the people who'd need it." Thomas folded the paper. He put it in his breast pocket. He did not say anything for a moment. "Write to the Kendall brothers," he said at last. "Tell them to come as arranged. Tell them Mrs. Whitaker sends her regards." Joseph nodded. He put his hat back on. He went to the door and then he stopped. "Mr. Whitaker," he said quietly, "if I'm speaking out of turn, you tell me and I'll let it alone. Go ahead. In 8 years working this land, I've gone to Mrs. Whitaker more times than I can count about things that needed doing. Problems with the fields, problems with the workers, problems with the accounts. Never once did she turn me away. Never once did she say it wasn't her concern." A pause. "I don't know what passed between you two. It's not my place to know. But I want you to understand that the way this place runs, the way it's run, that's her. That's been her for a long time." He left without waiting for an answer. Thomas stood in his kitchen with his cooling coffee and Joseph's words sitting in the air around him. And something began to shift in his chest, not dramatically. Not all at once. The way a very large stone shifts when the ground beneath it has been gradually softening almost imperceptibly. And then decisively, he went to Elizabeth's sitting room. He had rarely gone in there. It was her room in a way that the other shared rooms of the house were not the place where she did her correspondence and her accounts, and he now understood a great deal of the quiet work that kept Whitaker Hall and the land around it functioning. He opened the left drawer of the writing desk the way she had told him to, and found the surveyor's report. Exactly where she'd said it would be. He set it aside. He opened the other drawers. What he found was a record of a life he had not known was being lived. Files of correspondence with tradespeople, with neighboring landowners, with county officials, with a man in Richmond who turned out. When Thomas read the letters, to-be attorney Elizabeth had consulted about the property boundaries question, 2 years before the dispute with the Hargroves even formally began. Account books kept in her hand, covering the household and the kitchen garden, and a separate small fund he didn't recognize at first. He opened the account book for the fund and read the heading at the top of the first page. Relief Harlow County Families. Begun 1813. He turned the pages slowly. 3 years of careful entries. Small amounts, mostly $1 here. $2 there. Names he recognized: the Perrys, who had lost their barn to fire the previous winter. The Gideon widow who had 6 children and a failing farm. Old Marcus down on the South Road, who was too proud to ask for help directly, but whose name appeared in Elizabeth's book with a note beside it. Left at the church as a poor box donation at his suggestion. He knows it comes from us. Thomas set the book down. He sat at Elizabeth's desk in Elizabeth's chair and looked at the wall for a long time. He had known his wife was capable. He had known she was competent. He had valued those things the way a man values a good tool practically. Without sentiment. He had not known she was this. He had not known that while he was managing his hundreds of acres and his business dealings and his position in Harlow County society, Elizabeth had been quietly building something of her own, a parallel world of care and attention and forethought that touched everything around him without his ever once asking where it came from. He reached back into the drawer, and his fingers found something else, a small bundle of papers tied with a piece of blue ribbon. He untied it. Letters, not sent, not received, written in Elizabeth's hand and addressed to no one. He understood immediately that he should not read them. He held them in his hands for 30 seconds, and then he put them back in the drawer and closed it. Some things he was beginning to understand were not his. Had never been his, even when he thought they were. The realization hit him harder than he expected. He sat at her desk until Mrs. Porter came and knocked at the door to ask whether he wanted breakfast. And he said yes without turning around, and he stayed at the desk a while longer, looking at the drawer he'd closed. By the end of the first week, the county had worked itself into a state of opinion about the Whitakers that was, as these things tend to be, almost entirely wrong and yet not without its own rough justice. The prevailing view among the men who gathered at the barber shop and the tavern and the courthouse steps was that Elizabeth had overreacted to something that was fundamentally a private and unremarkable matter between a husband and wife. Harlan Forsythe said he reckoned she'd be back inside a month. The Reeves boys said women like Elizabeth, educated, strong-minded, always had this kind of thing in them. This tendency to make something large out of something small. And that Thomas was better off letting her work it out before she came home. He told her the truth, Harlan said, cracking a walnut on the fence post outside the dry goods store. Man tells his wife the truth and she runs off. That's what happens when you let them get too comfortable in their own opinions. Robert Gideon, who was 19 and loading a sack of cornmeal into his mother's wagon, did not say anything, but he thought about his mother, and about how his mother had kept the Gideon farm going after his father died, and about the name he had once seen in the Whitaker Relief Fund register when he'd helped Reverend Pierce with the church accounts. He did not say anything, but he thought about it. Martha Gideon said plenty to anyone who would listen, in the milliner's shop on Calhoun Street. Thomas Whitaker is a fool, she said flatly to her assistant and to the two women who happened to be in the shop that morning, choosing ribbons for summer bonnets. He is a very rich, respected, very thorough fool. Elizabeth Monroe has been holding that entire estate together with both hands since the day she married him. And he has never once looked down long enough to notice. Now she's gone, and he's standing there wondering why the house doesn't run itself. One of the ribbon-choosing women, a young wife named Abigail Horn, said carefully that surely Mr. Whitaker had noticed some of what his wife did. Men like Thomas Whitaker, Martha said, cutting a length of blue satin with a decisive snip, do not notice what women do. They notice what women fail to do. That's the whole problem. Abigail Horn went home and thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. Elizabeth, for her part, was not sitting still. This was, perhaps, the thing that most surprised Clara Whitfield, who had expected her niece to need time, quiet time, grief time, the slow work of sorting through 15 years and deciding what to keep from the wreckage. And Elizabeth did that work. She did it in the early mornings, sitting with her coffee before the rest of the farm was awake, going through things in her mind with the same systematic thoroughness she brought to account books and correspondence. But she also did other things. On the fourth day, she walked into Harlow with Clara and stopped at the school building on the corner of Maple and Third, a small, underfunded thing that served the children of the town's poorer families and had been badly managed for years. She had been corresponding with the school's overseer, a well-meaning but disorganized man named Aldous Pratt, for several months about certain administrative problems. She had done the correspondence from Whitaker Hall in the hours between her other duties because it had seemed important and because no one else was doing it. She spoke to Aldous Pratt for 45 minutes. When she left, she had agreed to review the school's accounts and help restructure its arrangement with the county for funding. That's more than you were doing before, Clara observed, as they walked back through the summer heat. I have more time now, Elizabeth said. Elizabeth, she paused. I know, Aunt Clara. I'm not rushing anything, I'm just not stopping. Either. I spent 15 years making myself small enough to fit inside Thomas Whitaker's idea of what a wife should be. I don't think I should start making myself small, again, because I'm in between things. Clara made the sound that meant she agreed but wasn't going to say so. What do you want? I want a life that is mine, Elizabeth said. I want work that I chose. I want. She stopped. Something shifted in her face. I want to be known. By someone. Not appreciated for what I produce or respected for how well I manage things. Known. For who I actually am. Clara looked at her niece for a long moment. You ever told him that? She said. In those words? Elizabeth was quiet for a few steps. No, she said, I never did. Maybe you ought to. Before you decide anything permanent. I don't think that changes what happened. Aunt Clara. No, Clara said, it doesn't change what happened. But it might change what happens next. The letter arrived at Clara's farm 11 days after Elizabeth had left Whitaker Hall. Delivered by Thomas's young stable hand, a boy of about 14 who handed it over with the solemnity of someone who understood he was involved in something significant. Elizabeth looked at the outside of it for a moment before she opened it. Thomas's handwriting on the envelope, controlled. Precise, a little stiff, exactly like him. She opened it at the kitchen table, with Clara pointedly at the other end of the room, doing something with a lot of unnecessary noise. It was not what she had expected. She had expected an apology, or an argument, or a practical request about the household. What she found was 2 pages in Thomas's hand, and the first line read, I went into your sitting room today to find the surveyor's report as you instructed. I found other things instead. She read the letter straight through without stopping. He did not apologize exactly. Thomas Whitaker was not a man who apologized easily. And she had always known that about him. But what he did, in those 2 careful pages, was describe what he had found. The account books, the correspondence files, The Harlow County Relief Fund. He described finding Joseph's note about the Miller Creek pasture and the Kendall brothers. He described sitting at her desk and understanding. For what he said was the first time, the full scope of what she had been doing. And then, in the second-to-last paragraph, he wrote, "I do not say this to change your mind about leaving, or to ask you to return. I say it because it is true and I should have known it long ago. And I did not. You were not simply a wife to this house. You were the better part of its intelligence and its conscience. And I never told you so because I never allowed myself to fully see it. I see it now. I am sorry for how long it took." The last paragraph said, "The beans in your garden are doing well. I have been watering them. I thought you would want to know." Elizabeth sat with the letter in her hands for a long time. Then she set it on the table, face down, and went out to help Clara mend the garden fence, because her hands needed something to do. "Good letter or bad letter?" Clara called from across the yard. "Complicated letter," Elizabeth called back. She picked up a hammer and started working. What Elizabeth did not know, what she could not have known, sitting at her aunt's kitchen table, was that something had happened in Harlow County the day before the letter was sent that had already changed the shape of things in ways she had not anticipated. It started with Reginald Forsythe. Reginald was Harlan Forsythe's older brother and a man of particular social ambition, the kind of ambition that fed on other people's difficulties. He had been, for several years, quietly covetous of a stretch of Whitaker land along the eastern ridge that adjacent to his own property, and that he had twice tried to purchase from Thomas and been turned down. When news spread that Elizabeth had left, Reginald saw an opportunity not in the marital situation itself, but in what it suggested. A distracted man, a household in disorder, a possible opening. He began carefully to spread a different version of the story. It started small, a word at the courthouse, a suggestion at the tavern. Not that Elizabeth had left Thomas, that was already known, but why she had left him. The version Reginald put in circulation was that she had left because there was someone else. A man, someone she had been corresponding with in the months before she departed. He did not name a man. He was too careful for that. He simply planted the question and let Harlow County do what Harlow County always did. Fill in the blank. Within 3 days, the story had its own momentum. By the end of the week, Elizabeth Monroe Whitaker had, in the collective imagination of a significant portion of Harlow County, left her husband for an unnamed lover. This was not only false but absurd to anyone who knew Elizabeth at all, but Reginald had been strategic. And the version he'd circulated appealed to a particular kind of human appetite for the complicated woman made simple by scandal. Thomas heard about it on a Thursday morning at the dry goods store. He heard it from the storekeeper, who told him in the apologetic tone of a man delivering bad news. And Thomas stood in the middle of the store for a moment, with a sack of feed in his hand, and a feeling moving through him that was, he would later reflect, the clearest and most uncomplicated feeling he'd had in years. Anger. Clean, focused, certain. "Who's saying it?" he said. The storekeeper looked uncomfortable. "Mr. Whitaker." "I don't. Who is spreading this story about my wife?" the storekeeper told him. Thomas put the feed sack down on the counter. He turned and walked out of the store. He rode directly to Reginald Forsythe's property and found the man in his front yard talking to his foreman. And he did not dismount. He sat on his horse and looked down at Reginald Forsythe and said, in a voice that carried clearly to the foreman and the 2 field hands who were close enough to hear, "I know what you've been saying about Elizabeth. You will stop saying it. You will correct it wherever you've said it, and you will make clear that what you said was a lie you invented, because you wanted my land and saw an opportunity. If I hear that version of the story from one more person in this county, I will take you before the magistrate for defamation. My wife's name will not be used to serve your purposes. Do you understand me?" Reginald Forsythe opened his mouth. "I am not asking you a question," Thomas said. "I am telling you what is going to happen." He rode back toward Whitaker Hall. And the feeling in his chest that clean, certain anger was already beginning to shade into something else. Something quieter and in its way more uncomfortable. Because he had defended Elizabeth's name in the middle of Reginald Forsyth's front yard. And it had been the right thing to do, and he had not hesitated to do it. And yet somewhere underneath the rightness of it was a question he couldn't quite avoid. Why had it taken a lie about his wife to make him speak that clearly in her defense? He had never, in 15 years of marriage, spoken about Elizabeth to anyone in Harlow County with that kind of force. He had spoken about her capacity. He had spoken about her management of the household. He had said more than once that she was a capable woman, meaning it as a compliment, not understanding until now how much smaller it was than what she deserved. He had defended her reputation against a lie. He had never, not once, championed her truth. He rode home in the afternoon heat, and that thought rode with him all the way. The story of what Thomas had said to Reginald Forsyth spread faster than any story Harlow County had circulated in years. By supper time it had been in and out of every household in a 3-mile radius. By the following morning, it had reached Clara Whitfield's farm. Clara told Elizabeth at breakfast, with the careful neutralness of a woman presenting evidence without a recommendation. Elizabeth was quiet for a long time after. He rode over there himself, she said. Didn't send a man. Didn't write a letter. Rode over himself. Sat on his horse and said it in front of witnesses. Clara poured herself more coffee. Reginald Forsyth has been very quietly correcting his story all over the county since yesterday evening. Elizabeth looked at her plate. She picked up her fork and put it down again. That doesn't fix anything, she said. No, Clara agreed, it doesn't. It's one afternoon. One confrontation, it changed 15 years. No, Clara said again. It surely doesn't. Elizabeth picked up her fork again and actually used it this time. They ate in silence for a while. Aunt Clara, Elizabeth said at last. Why do you think he did it? Clara looked at her over the rim of her coffee cup. You know why. I want to hear you say it. Because he's starting to understand what he had, Clara said simply. Men like Thomas Whitaker, they don't learn things quick. They learn things when they're standing in the empty space where the thing used to be. He's standing in it now. She set down her cup. The question is not why he did it. The question is what you're going to do with the information. Elizabeth was quiet again. Outside, the summer morning was already hot, the air thick and still. I don't know yet, she said honestly. That's a good answer, Clara said. That's an honest one. Aldous Pratt came to find Elizabeth at Clara's farm 3 days later. And what he brought with him was not just gratitude for her help with the school accounts, but a problem that stopped her cold the moment she heard it. 3 families in the southern part of Harlow County, the kind of families that appeared in Elizabeth's relief fund register, had been served notice by the county land office that they were occupying land to which they did not hold clear title. The notices had come without warning, had been filed by an attorney Elizabeth did not recognize, and cited a technicality in a decades-old land grant that most people in the county had assumed was long settled. Aldous was worried because he didn't understand the legal mechanism. Elizabeth was worried because she did. She understood it because she had spent 2 years corresponding with the Richmond attorney about the Hargrove boundary dispute and had read enough property law in the process to recognize the shape of what she was looking at. What she was looking at was not a technicality. What she was looking at was a manufactured claim, the kind that required someone with money and a willingness to use a lawyer creatively, and the kind that poor farming families with no legal representation could not easily fight. How many families, she said to Aldous. 3 for certain. Possibly 5. And the notices were all filed by the same attorney? Yes. Ma'am. A man named Cutter out of Richmond. Elizabeth sat with that information for about 30 seconds. I know who has the money for a Richmond attorney, she said quietly. Aldous looked at her. I think Reginald Forsyth did not take Thomas's warning as the end of the matter, she said. I think he shifted his ambitions to land he could reach without going through Thomas directly. She stood up. I need to write some letters. Mrs. Whitaker, this is a complicated legal matter. Pratt, she said, and her voice had the particular quality it got when she had already made a decision, and the only question remaining was the route. I have been handling complicated legal matters for this county for 3 years without anyone's help or knowledge. I am not going to stop because I have changed my address. She sat down at Clara's small writing table and began to write. She wrote to the Richmond attorney who had helped her with the boundary dispute. She wrote to the county registrar, requesting copies of the filed notices and the original land grant documents. She wrote, after some thought, to a woman named Harriet Voss in Richmond, a widow of some property and considerable intelligence, whom Elizabeth had corresponded with on and off for years, who knew people in the legal community and was not afraid to make inquiries. And then she sat for a moment, pen in hand, and thought. She wrote one more letter. She addressed it to Thomas Whitaker. She did not write it with warmth. She did not write it with anger. She wrote it with the clear, practical directness she brought to all her correspondence. And what it said was, she had reason to believe Reginald Forsythe was attempting to dispossess 3 to 5 Harlow County families of their land through manufactured legal claims, that she intended to oppose it, and that if Thomas wished to lend his name and standing to that opposition it would be useful, but that she would proceed regardless. She sealed the letter. She gave it to Aldous to deliver on his way home. Then she made herself a cup of tea and sat with it, and thought about the thing Clara had said. The question is what you're going to do with the information. She didn't have the full answer yet, but she was beginning to see its shape. And its shape was not, she understood, simply about Thomas. It was about what she wanted her life to look like, what she was willing to build. And on what terms and for whom. She had built things for other people her whole life. She was not sorry for it. She did not regret the care she had taken. The work she had done, the quiet competence she had brought to everything her hands had touched. But she was 43 years old. No, she was 28 years old, and it felt like 43, and she was finished building things she did not own. Whatever came next was going to be hers. She drank her tea in the summer heat of her aunt's small kitchen and let herself want that. Clearly, without apology, the way she had wanted it for a long time. Privately, in the part of herself she had never fully let Thomas see. She let herself want it, and it felt like the first completely honest thing she had done in years. Thomas's reply to Elizabeth's letter came back the same day Aldous delivered it. That alone told her something. Thomas Whitaker was not a man who acted quickly on anything. He deliberated. He weighed. He considered consequences from 3 directions before he committed to a course. The fact that his answer arrived before supper, written in a hand slightly less controlled than usual, told her that whatever was happening inside him had begun to move faster than his habits could contain. The letter was short. It said, "I will attend whatever proceeding is necessary. Tell me where and when. Reginald Forsythe has done enough damage in this county, and I should have seen it coming. I am sorry that you saw it first, and that I am only now learning to be useful in the right direction." Elizabeth read it twice. She set it on the table next to the other one. The one about the beans in her garden. 2 letters. 2 weeks apart. And already Thomas Whitaker was writing sentences she would not have believed him capable of at the start of the summer. She did not let herself feel too much about that. Not yet. There was work to do first. The county magistrate's office was on the 2nd floor of the Harlow courthouse. A building that smelled permanently of pipe tobacco and old paper, and the particular kind of self-importance that gathers in rooms where decisions are made about other people's lives. Elizabeth had been in that building twice before, once when she'd accompanied Thomas to a deed filing, and once on her own 2 years prior, when she had quietly consulted the clerk about the Hargrove boundary documents. The clerk had been politely doubtful about her purpose, and then, when she'd laid out the specific documents she needed and the precise legal question she wanted answered, had become considerably less so. She went to the magistrate's office on a Tuesday morning in the third week after she had left Whitaker Hall, with Aldous Pratt beside her and a leather satchel of documents under her arm. The families facing the land notices the Coopers, the Whitfields of the South Road, who were no relation to Clara, and the Tremaines had asked her to help them understand what they were dealing with. She had spent 5 days reading and corresponding and understanding it, and now she was ready to explain it to someone with the authority to do something about it. Magistrate Horace Dunbar was 60 years old, thick through the middle, and had been running the Harlow County Land Office for 22 years. He knew Elizabeth Whitaker by sight and by reputation. He did not know her, Elizabeth suspected, as anything other than Thomas Whitaker's wife. She was about to change that. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, standing when she came in, which was automatic courtesy, the reflex of a man raised to stand for women, regardless of what he thought of their business. "I was not expecting that. What can I do for you this morning?" "You can look at these documents," Elizabeth said, and set the satchel on his desk and opened it. "And then you can tell me whether the claim filed by Aldridge Cutter on behalf of an unnamed party against the Cooper, Whitfield, and Tremaine properties was filed correctly under Virginia Land Code, or whether certain critical steps in the documentation process were, let's say, abbreviated." Dunbar looked at the satchel. He looked at Elizabeth. He looked at Aldous Pratt, who gave him a look that said clearly, "I know. I had the same reaction. Just read what she's put together." Dunbar sat back down and reached for the papers. She had been thorough. She had been, as she always was, completely thorough. The claim against the three families rested on a reading of a 1,791 land grant that was, on its face, technically plausible. The grant language was ambiguous enough that a creative attorney could argue it left certain boundary questions unresolved. But Elizabeth had written to the State Land Office in Richmond and obtained the survey record from 1,791 itself, which had never been formally entered into the Harlow County Register because of an administrative error 30 years prior. That survey record settled the boundary question explicitly and entirely in favor of the families currently living on the land. The claim, in other words, had been filed against documents that the county register didn't know existed, by an attorney who had either not found the survey record or had found it and chosen not to disclose it. Dunbar read in silence for a long time. Elizabeth sat across from him and let him read. She had learned, over years of managing correspondence and negotiations that Thomas never knew about, that the most effective thing you could do once you had laid out evidence was to stop talking and let the evidence do its work. "Where did you get the 1,791 survey?" Dunbar said at last. "I wrote to the State Land Office," Elizabeth said. "They provided a certified copy. That copy is the last document in the packet." Dunbar found it. He read it. He set it down. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said carefully, "are you suggesting that the attorney who filed this claim was aware of the survey and did not disclose it?" "I am suggesting that the claim cannot proceed given this document's existence," Elizabeth said. "Whether the attorney was aware of it and made a choice, or whether he failed to do adequate research, is a question for the Bar Association. What I am asking you to determine is whether the claim should be dismissed." Dunbar looked at her for a moment with an expression she recognized. The expression of a man recalibrating. "You've been in correspondence with the State Land Office for several weeks." "Yes, on behalf of these families. On behalf of the county," Elizabeth said. "These families are part of it." A pause. Then Dunbar leaned back in his chair and let out a breath. "I'll need a week to review this properly." "Of course," Elizabeth said. "I'll leave the full packet with you. You'll find I've indexed everything. The relevant statutes are tabbed." She stood. She picked up the now empty satchel. She extended her hand, which slightly startled him, and he shook it. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said as she was turning to go, "does your husband know you've been doing this kind of work?" Elizabeth paused at the door. She turned her head just enough to look at him over her shoulder. "No," she said. "A beat. He does now." She left. Thomas was waiting outside the courthouse. She had not expected that. She stopped on the steps when she saw his horse at the post. And then she saw him, standing to the side with his hat in his hand. And everything in her went very still. He looked different than she remembered. It had only been 3 weeks, and yet something in his bearing had shifted something around the eyes. Something in the way he was standing, which was less like a man who owned a significant portion of Harlow County, and more like a man who was not entirely sure of his ground. "I thought you might need a witness," he said. "Someone who could speak to Dunbar's questions about the land records if it came to that." He paused. "I should have sent word first. I didn't think no," Elizabeth said. She came down the last 2 steps and stood on the same level with him. "It's all right, Dunbar didn't need you, but thank you." An awkward silence. The kind they had always been good at. The kind that used to settle over their supper table and feel like the natural order of things. And that now felt like something that needed to be crossed. "How did it go?" "Well, I think he'll have an answer in a week. The documents are conclusive if he reads them properly." She looked at him steadily. "This was Reginald Forsyth. I don't have proof, but the attorney is Richmond-based, and those families have nothing anyone would want except their land." "I know," Thomas said. "I've been thinking the same thing." He paused. "I spoke to my own attorney yesterday. There may be grounds for a separate action against Forsyth if Dunbar dismisses the claim and we can establish the pattern." Elizabeth looked at him. "You've been working on it." "Yes." He said it without pride. "As a fact, I should have been paying attention to what Forsyth was doing years ago." "You were right about him. I didn't take it seriously." She remembered the conversation. 2 years ago, at the supper table, she had mentioned to Thomas that Reginald Forsyth's interest in their eastern ridge seemed more calculated than social. Thomas had said, "Reginald is ambitious, it's not illegal." And moved on. She had filed it away. She had kept her eye on it herself. She had, eventually, taken steps she hadn't told Thomas about, because by that point she had learned that telling King Thomas about things was not always the same as Thomas hearing them. "No," she said. "You didn't." He held her gaze. "I'm saying you were right. I'm not asking you to tell me it's fine." It wasn't fine. That stopped her a little. Thomas Whitaker standing in front of the Harlow courthouse with his hat in his hand. Telling her she had been right and not asking her to release him from the acknowledgement of it. "All right," she said carefully, "Elizabeth." He said her name the way he used to. Sometimes, when they were first married with both syllables. Deliberate. I'd like to talk to you. Not about Forsyth. Not about the land case, about us. About what I said. I've been trying to find the right words for 3 weeks, and I don't know that I have them. But I'd like to try." She looked at him for a long moment. The summer heat pressed down on both of them. A cart went by on the road, and someone called out a greeting to Thomas, and he nodded without looking away from her. "Not here," she said, "and not today." A pause. "Come to Aunt Clara's on Saturday. Come in the morning when it's cool. We'll sit on the porch." He nodded. He put his hat back on. He mounted and rode away. And Elizabeth watched him go, and the feeling in her chest was the most complicated thing she'd carried in 28 years of living. She told Clara about it that evening. Sitting on the porch in the last of the light, Clara rocked slowly in her chair and listened without interrupting. Which was unusual for her, and when Elizabeth finished, she said, "What are you afraid of?" Elizabeth thought about it honestly. "That I go back," she said, "and nothing has actually changed. That what I'm seeing is a man in the first weeks of an absence, when the loss is still sharp and the habits haven't had time to come back. That by winter, by next spring, we'd be right back to what we were. And I would know this time that I chose it. I couldn't unknow that." "That's a fair fear," Clara said. "I know it's fair. What do I do with it, you tell him," Clara said. You put it in plain language on Saturday morning, and you watch what he does with it. A man who deflects or explains it away is one thing. A man who sits with it and doesn't flinch is another. She rocked. You've spent 15 years trying to read Thomas Whitaker from the outside. Try talking to him straight for once. I talked to him straight the night I left, Elizabeth said. I asked him if he loved me, and he told you the truth, Clara said. I know. I'm not saying that wasn't painful. I'm saying maybe the problem was never that he told you the truth that night. Maybe the problem was that neither of you had been telling the truth for 15 years before it. Elizabeth sat with that. It landed somewhere deep and stayed. Saturday came in hot and still. The way late summer mornings in Virginia come when the season is trying to make a final point before conceding to fall. Thomas arrived earlier than she'd expected. She was still in the kitchen when Clara came to tell her his horse was at the post. And she took a breath and set down the dish towel and went out to the porch. He was already seated in the chair she'd gestured at 2 weeks ago when he'd come the first time. He had brought nothing with him, no papers, no letters. No practical purpose, just himself in his good summer coat. Hat resting on his knee, Elizabeth sat down across from him. Clara brought coffee and very deliberately went back inside. They sat in silence for a moment. It was not the terrible silence of avoidance. It was the silence of two people gathering themselves for something that mattered. Thomas spoke first. I've been trying to think, he said slowly, about what to say to you. I've started letters I didn't send. I've practiced things in my own head and then heard how they sounded and discarded them. He looked at his hat rather than at her. I keep coming back to the same problem, which is that I don't know how to do this. I don't have a language for it. I was raised by a man who believed that providing was the same as loving. And I believed it too, and I am standing here at 35 years old understanding that I built a marriage on that belief, and the belief was wrong. And I don't know how to tell you how sorry I am for that in a way that is adequate. Because I don't think there is an adequate way. Elizabeth was very still. I heard what you said, he continued, still looking at his hat. The night you left, when you said you wanted to know if I loved you, not the idea of a wife, not the woman who kept the house. I heard it. And I answered it honestly, and I have spent 3 weeks understanding that my honest answer was the answer of a man who had been blind in a very specific and terrible way. He looked up at her finally. I knew your capabilities. I knew your competence. I valued both of them. I used both of them. He said the last sentence with a flatness that held its own kind of condemnation. I didn't know you. The air between them was very still. Tell me, Elizabeth said. He blinked. What? Tell me 3 things about Elizabeth Monroe. She said it quietly, with no edge in it, the way a person asks a question they genuinely need the answer to. Not Elizabeth Whitaker, not your wife, not the woman who managed your estate. Elizabeth Monroe. He was quiet. She watched him think. And what she watched was real thinking, not the performance of it. Not the scramble for a socially adequate answer, but actual searching. His hands tightened slightly on his hat. You read the last page of a book first, he said. She had not expected that. What? The first winter we were married. I came into the sitting room and found you reading. And I noticed you had the book open to what I thought was near the end. And I thought you'd nearly finished it, and then I saw your face, and it was the face of someone just beginning something. You were reading the last page first. He paused. I meant to ask you about it. I didn't. But another pause. Last week, I found myself thinking about why, and I thought you'd told me once, before we married, that your mother died when you were 7. Very suddenly. And I thought, she reads the last page first because she learned early that things end without warning. And she needs to know the ending is all right before she can let herself care about the beginning. Elizabeth was very still. I don't know if that's right, Thomas said, but that's what I thought. The silence stretched for one long breath. 2. That's right, she said quietly. That's exactly right. He looked at her. Something shifted in his face, not relief exactly. Something more careful than relief. Second, he said. You don't sing in the house, but when you work in the garden, when you think no one can hear you sing, a pause. You always stop when you know someone's nearby. I don't know why. But you have a very fine voice, Elizabeth, and every time I heard you and you stopped, I thought I've done that. I've made myself a person that she hides from. Elizabeth pressed her lips together. Her eyes were dry, but it was taking effort. Third, Thomas said. He stopped. He looked at his hands, then back at her. Third is I don't have a clean observation for this one. What I have is a feeling. I think you are a person who gives everything to every corner of her life and saves almost nothing for herself. I think you have been doing that so long that you've almost forgotten there's a self to save anything for. And I think he stopped again. I think that is partly the result of having lived with a man who made you feel that what you kept for yourself was less important than what you gave to him and his house and his land. He met her eyes. I am not going to tell you I didn't do that to you. I did. I want you to know I see it. The morning was absolutely quiet. Elizabeth looked at Thomas Whitaker across the distance of a porch in 15 years, and one question neither of them had known how to ask until it was almost too late. And she felt something inside her that was not forgiveness, not yet. Maybe not for a long time, but was something adjacent to it. Something that had a future in it. How long have you been watching me? She said at last. Her voice was very quiet. Apparently not long enough, he said. And apparently longer than I knew. Clara's screen door opened and she appeared with a plate of biscuits and the expression of a woman who had heard enough through the window to know when to materialize with food. She set the plate on the small table between them and went back inside without a word. And the appearance of the biscuits somehow made everything slightly more survivable. Elizabeth reached for one, so did Thomas. They ate in silence for a moment. And the silence was different now, not the terrible kind. Not the avoidant kind. The kind that exists between two people who have just said true things and are waiting to see what the true things mean. I haven't decided anything, Elizabeth said. I know, Thomas said. I'm not asking you to. I need you to understand that. Whatever this morning has been, whatever you've learned in the last 3 weeks, it doesn't resolve what happened. What you said. 15 years of she stopped. Started again. I loved you, Thomas. I want you to know that. Not because it makes things simpler, but because it's true. And I've been carrying it without saying it, and that has been its own kind of dishonesty. Thomas was very still. I loved you, she said again, and I built myself around the hope that someday you'd see me. Really see me. And when you told me at that supper table that you never had, that you'd never loved me, I realized I'd been waiting for something that I should have demanded years ago. Or let go of years ago. And I didn't know which was right. So I did nothing. For years. Let me finish. She looked at him steadily. You answered my question honestly. I don't wish you hadn't. A lie would have been worse. But the answer broke something. And I want you to know it broke something real. Not just pride. Not just comfort. Something I had built my life on. For 15 years. She set down her biscuit. I will not go back to the way things were. I'm not asking you to, he said immediately. I mean it, Thomas. Not a version of it. Not a softer version with the same structure underneath. If anything is going to be different, it has to be actually different. Not managed. Not performed. She met his eyes, and I don't know if you're capable of that. I'm not saying it cruelly. I genuinely don't know. I'm not sure you know either. He held her gaze. He did not flinch. Did not pull back. Did not resort to the careful withdrawal she had seen so many times. He sat with it the way Clara had said a certain kind of man would. If he was worth sitting with. No, he said, I don't know if I'm capable of it. I know I want to be. I know I understand, for the first time, what it would require. I know I am willing to find out. A pause. I'm asking you for the chance to find out. not a guarantee. Not forgiveness, just the chance. Elizabeth looked at him for a long moment. Through the window behind her, she could hear Clara moving around. And outside somewhere a horse stamped and blew, and the summer morning held still as though it was waiting too. "There's a hearing," Elizabeth said. "Magistrate Dunbar is looking at the Forsyth land case next Friday. I'll need someone there who carries weight with the court." Thomas recognized the shift. He let her make it. "I'll be there," he said. "And the families, the Coopers and the Tremaines and the South Road Whitfields. Someone needs to speak to them directly, tell them where the case stands, so they're not sitting in the dark waiting on a legal process they don't understand. You have the standing to do that. I'll do it this week. And Thomas," she looked at him, "when you talk to them, don't tell them what I found. Don't say I handled it. Don't make it a story about your wife. Tell them the county is fighting it. That's the story. The county standing for its own people." He looked at her for a long moment. "They should know it was you," he said. "They'll find out eventually. They always do." A small pause. "Right now what they need is to know they're not alone. That's more important than credit." Thomas nodded slowly. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen before, not admiration exactly, which was something she had always feared as a substitute for real regard. Something quieter. Something that looked in a way she was almost afraid to name. Like the beginning of genuine recognition. "All right," he said. They finished the biscuits. He did not stay much longer. There was no dramatic departure, no promises made, no conclusions drawn. He put on his hat and he thanked Clara for the coffee when she came out to say goodbye. And he rode away down the lane, and Elizabeth watched him go from the porch. "Well," Clara said. "He knew about the last page of the book," Elizabeth said. Clara was quiet for a moment. Did he? He'd noticed it years ago. He'd thought about why. He had an explanation. She paused. He was right. Clara sat down in her chair and rocked once. "That's not nothing." "No," Elizabeth said. "It's not nothing." She picked up her coffee cup. It had gone cold. "But it's not enough," she said. "No," Clara agreed. "Not yet." The Forsyth situation broke open 5 days later, the day before the magistrate's hearing, and it broke in a way no one had anticipated. A man arrived in Harlow on Thursday afternoon, a surveyor from Richmond. Not the one Elizabeth had worked with, but a different one. Younger, who had been sent by Aldridge Cutter's office. He was there, he told the county clerk, to conduct an independent review of the land in question before the hearing. A routine precaution, he said, perfectly standard. Robert Gideon, who was loading his mother's wagon outside the dry goods store when the man arrived and made inquiries, watched the surveyor go into the courthouse and felt something sit wrong with him. He thought about it on the ride home. He thought about Mrs. Whitaker's documents, which his mother had spoken about. He thought about the timing, a surveyor arriving the day before a hearing, sent by the same attorney who had filed the claim. He turned his wagon around and rode to Clara Whitfield's farm. Elizabeth came to the door when he knocked. He told her what he'd seen. She listened without interrupting, and then she said, "Did he have paperwork? An order from Dunbar authorizing the survey?" Robert thought. "I don't rightly know, ma'am. I didn't see any. He wouldn't need to show it at the dry goods store," she said. More to herself than to Robert, she thought fast. "Thank you, Robert." This was the right thing to do. She went inside and wrote 2 notes. She sent one to Thomas. She sent the other to Magistrate Dunbar directly, noting that an independent survey conducted without the court's formal authorization, on the eve of a hearing by a party connected to the filing attorney, might constitute an irregularity that the court would want to address before proceeding. She sent both notes by Robert, who was already back on his horse and clearly pleased to be useful. Then she went and told Clara what had happened. "He's trying to manufacture new evidence," Clara said, "before the hearing, or discredit the old evidence, depending on what the survey produces. Elizabeth picked up her shawl. I need to go to town, Elizabeth. I'll be back by supper time. She paused at the door. This is what I do, Aunt Clara. This is what I'm good at. I'm not going to stand here while 3 families lose their land because a man with money and a dishonest lawyer decided their land was worth taking. Clara looked at her. You reckon Thomas will be there? He said he would be. You trust that? Elizabeth paused. Thought about it honestly, the way she'd been trying to do everything lately. I trust that he said it, she said finally. I'm going to let him show me the rest. She walked out into the summer heat. And the sound of her boots on the path was exactly what it always was, deliberate. Unhurried, certain. Some things Elizabeth Monroe had known since she was 7 years old. End without warning. The smart thing was to know the ending before you let yourself care about the beginning. But some things, rarer things, harder things you could not read the last page of. Some things you had to walk into without knowing, and trust that you were strong enough to survive whatever the last page said. She walked toward town, and she did not look back. And the morning held its breath around her. Thomas was already at the courthouse when she arrived. He was standing in the main hall with Magistrate Dunbar and a man Elizabeth did not recognize, tall. Young, carrying a leather instrument case, she identified immediately as belonging to a surveyor. Dunbar looked uncomfortable. Thomas looked, when he caught sight of Elizabeth coming through the door, like a man who had been waiting for reinforcements and was profoundly relieved they had arrived. She crossed the floor to them without slowing. Mrs. Whitaker, Dunbar said, with the expression of a man who was already tired. Your note this morning, yes, Elizabeth said. I received word yesterday afternoon that this gentleman arrived in Harlow carrying out a survey on the disputed properties. I'd like to know whether the court authorized that survey. Because if it was not authorized, any results it produces should not be admitted into tomorrow's hearing. The surveyor, young, clearly uncomfortable, looked at Dunbar. I was told the court had approved. I have authorized no survey, Dunbar said flatly. He looked at the man steadily. Who told you the court had approved it? A pause. Mr. Cutter's office, sir. Then Mr. Cutter's office lied to you, Thomas said. He said it without heat, just as a statement of fact, and to this court. The words landed in the hall like a dropped stone. The surveyor went slightly pale. Elizabeth watched it happen. She watched Thomas stand there, not posturing, not performing, and say the clear, necessary thing in front of a magistrate and a stranger. And she thought about what Clara had said, a man who sits with it and doesn't flinch. He wasn't flinching, Mr. Dunbar, Elizabeth said. Turning back to the magistrate. Given this, I'd like to request that the hearing tomorrow proceed on the existing documents, the documents I've already provided. And I'd like to request that you consider whether the filing itself, given the false representation made to this surveyor, warrants additional scrutiny before any ruling. Dunbar looked at her. He looked at Thomas. He looked at the surveyor, who was holding his instrument case like a man wishing very much that he had accepted a different commission this week. I think, Dunbar said slowly, that we have rather more to discuss than I anticipated. He straightened. I'll want statements from all of you. Mrs. Whitaker. Mr. Whitaker, if you'll come upstairs. He turned and went toward the stairs. The surveyor followed, looking miserable. Thomas fell into step beside Elizabeth. He said quietly, for her ears only, you got here fast. Robert Gideon rode to Clara's last night, she said equally quietly. He saw the man arrive in town. Smart boy. His mother raised him right, she kept walking. Thomas. After this, she kept her eyes forward. After the hearing tomorrow, when this is settled. I want to have a real conversation, not about property law. Not about Forsyth, about what you said Saturday. About what comes next. A pause. I'm not making any promises, I know that, he said. But I'm willing to have the conversation. He said nothing for a moment. Then, very quietly, that's enough. They went up the stairs together. and behind them the summer heat pressed at the courthouse windows. And Harlow County held its breath. Magistrate Dunbar dismissed the claim on a Friday morning in front of a courthouse that was, by Harlow County standards, unusually full. Word had gotten around. It always did. By the time the hearing began, the benches in the public gallery held more people than most civil proceedings drew in a year. Farmers, shopkeepers, the Reverend Pierce and his wife, Martha Gideon from the milliner's shop, Robert Gideon, sitting beside his mother with the particular straight-backed posture of a young man who knows he played part in something. The Cooper family sat in the front row, the Tremaines beside them. Old Samuel Whitfield of the South Road, who was 64 years old and had lived on that land since before Virginia was properly a state, sat with his hands folded on his knees and his jaw set like a man prepared for either outcome but not surrendered to either. Elizabeth sat at the side table with her documents. Thomas sat beside her. That fact alone, Thomas Whitaker sitting beside his estranged wife at a county magistrate's hearing, publicly, where everyone could see, had already generated more commentary in Harlow than the land case itself. Harlan Forsyth was notably absent, so was Reginald. Dunbar read his findings in the measured, unhurried voice of a man who understood that what he was saying mattered and did not intend to rush it. The 1,791 survey record, he said, was unambiguous. The filing by Aldridge Cutter's office had either failed to discover a document that diligent research would have found, or had discovered it and proceeded regardless. Either possibility, he said, with a flatness that told the room exactly what he thought, reflected poorly on the due diligence of the filing party. The claim was dismissed. The three families held clear title to their land. The court was forwarding its findings to the Virginia Bar Association for review of the filing attorney's conduct. When he finished, Samuel Whitfield of the South Road put his face in his hands. His daughter, sitting beside him, put her arm around his shoulders. Elizabeth looked at the table. She was not going to cry in the Harlow County Courthouse. She was absolutely not going to do that. She pressed her hands flat on the documents in front of her and breathed. Thomas, beside her, said nothing, but his hand moved on the table just slightly. Just an inch until it was beside hers. Not touching. Just beside. She did not move away. Afterward, in the press of people talking, and the Cooper family shaking hands, and Samuel Whitfield trying to compose himself while his daughter pretended not to notice, Martha Gideon appeared at Elizabeth's elbow with the directness that was her defining characteristic. "You did that," Martha said flatly. "The whole county knows you did that." "The documents did it," Elizabeth said. "The documents don't find themselves, Elizabeth Monroe." Martha looked at her with the sharp fondness of a woman who had watched a friend undervalue herself for years and was no longer willing to observe it politely. "Take the credit. You've earned it." Elizabeth looked at her. "Thank you, Martha. Don't thank me. Start a school." Martha said it like it was a logical continuation of the previous sentence, which in her mind it apparently was. "You've been talking to Aldous Pratt about that school for months. Stop talking. The county needs it and you're the one to do it, and you have been burying yourself in other people's affairs long enough to know exactly how it should run." Then she was gone, pushing back through the crowd toward the door, leaving Elizabeth standing there with that particular feeling of having been seen very clearly by someone who was not going to let you pretend they hadn't. Thomas materialized at her shoulder. "What did she say?" "She told me to start a school." A pause. "She's right," he said. Elizabeth looked at him sideways. "You don't know anything about the school." "No," he said. "But I know you've been corresponding with Aldous Pratt since February. And I know that when you give something your attention, it tends to become considerably more functional than it was before." He paused. I'm not reducing it to management. I mean that you care about it. And the things you care about tend to flourish." She looked at him for a moment. It was, she thought, a genuinely different sentence from any he would have said 6 weeks ago. Not because it was more flattering, because it was more specific. He was beginning to learn the difference between valuing what she produced and seeing who she was. It was a beginning, but it was real. The hearing went well, she said, turning back toward the door. It did, he agreed, walking beside her. Dunbar did the right thing. He had good documents to work with. He did. A pause. Elizabeth, can we have that conversation today? I know you said after the hearing. I know I said I wouldn't push. He stopped just inside the courthouse door. And she stopped with him, and the noise of the crowd flowed around them. I've been thinking about what you said, about the conversation you want to have. And I want to have it while I still have the nerve. Because I have found, over the past several weeks, that nerve is not something I can necessarily maintain indefinitely, despite everything. Something in her almost smiled. That might be the most honest thing you've said to me in 15 years, she said. I know, he said. I'm trying to make a habit of it. They walked. There was nowhere formal to go, no neutral ground that felt right for the conversation they needed to have. So they walked through the quieter streets east of the courthouse, while the town behind them buzzed with the aftermath of the hearing. And Thomas talked. He talked in a way she had never heard him talk before, not managed. Not calculated, not with the careful reserve that had always characterized how he moved through the world. He talked the way a man talks when he has been alone with his own thoughts for long enough that they have started to press outward. He told her that in the weeks since she had left, he had been doing something he had never done before, which was sit in her sitting room in the evenings. Not to go through the drawers again, not to work, just to sit. And that sitting there had produced in him a series of realizations that he was not entirely comfortable with, but that he was trying to look at directly rather than manage away. He told her that he had understood, gradually and then all at once, that he had married her with an idea of what a wife was and had then, without ever articulating it or examining it, spent 15 years expecting her to inhabit that idea without complaint. That he had taken her competence as a given, the way you take a good foundation for granted, present beneath everything. Never thought about, only noticed when something starts to crack. I told myself respecting you was enough, he said. I told myself that a man who does not deceive his wife, who provides for her, who does not mistreat her, is doing his part. I believed that. He was looking straight ahead as he walked. I had no idea how much I was taking. I had no idea that every piece of the life I thought I was building for us was being built by you. And that you were doing it in the hours I wasn't looking. And that you were doing it without acknowledgement. And that at some point that had to become unbearable. Elizabeth walked beside him and let him talk. The garden, he said. I keep thinking about the garden. I walked through it again 2 days ago. There are things growing in there that I can't name, varieties I've never seen. Things you've been cultivating for years, and I didn't know. I didn't know what was in my own garden because I never looked. A pause. I don't mean the garden. I know you don't, she said. He stopped walking. She stopped with him. I don't love you the way I should have loved you, he said. I don't know how to do it yet. I'm not going to tell you that I've figured it out in 3 weeks when I should have figured it out in 3 years. But I know what I didn't do, and I know why it was wrong. And I am asking you not to come back, not to forgive me. Not to pretend the last 15 years were something other than what they were. He turned to look at her directly. I'm asking you to tell me what you actually want. Not what's practical, not what Harlow County expects. What you want, Elizabeth. For yourself. She looked at him. She took her time. I want to finish what I started with the school, she said. I want to run it properly, not as a charity addition to someone else's life. My own project with my name on it that I answer for myself. All right, I want my own account. My own money, separate from the estate accounts, that I control and spend as I see fit. Without consultation or approval. He nodded without hesitating. Done. I want to be spoken to as a partner in the decisions of the estate. Not consulted after the fact. Not managed, present at the beginning, when decisions are being made. Yes, he said. That should have been true from the start. And I want... She stopped. This last one was the hardest. Not because it was complicated. Because it was simple, and the simple ones had always been the hardest to say out loud. I want to be known, Thomas. Not managed. Not appreciated for my usefulness. Known. I want you to ask me what I think, not what I've done. I want you to ask me what I'm afraid of and what I love and what I want for myself when no one is watching. I want to be a person to you, not a function. The word landed in the space between them and stayed. Thomas looked at her for a long moment. His face had the look of a man who has been shown the shape of something he has always known was missing, and is only now able to name it. I don't know how to do all of that, he said. Not naturally. Not, he held her gaze. But I know what not trying has cost. I know that now, and I am telling you that I want to learn. A pause. If you'll give me the chance to learn. Elizabeth looked at him, really looked at him. The way she had been doing more carefully since she had left. Assessing not what he said but how he said it, whether the words were real or constructed, whether the man in front of her was performing change or experiencing it. What she saw was a man who was uncomfortable and honest about being uncomfortable, who was not wrapping his appeal in charm or in the social leverage that his name in Harlow County could have provided, who was standing in front of her without those things, which were the things that had always made him feel safe in the world, and asking, I'm not coming home yet, she said. He nodded. I understand. I need more time, not to punish you. Because I need to be sure, I know, he said. Take whatever time you need. But I'm not closing the door. She said it clearly, with her eyes on his. I want you to know that. I'm not closing it. Something moved in his face that was not quite relief and was not quite hope, but was the quiet presence of both. Thank you, he said, simply. Like a man who knows that what he's been given is not what he asked for, and is more than he deserved, and is exactly what was right. September came in gradually, the heat loosening its grip on Virginia by degrees. The mornings turning crisp at the edges, while the afternoons held on to summer with the stubbornness of something not yet ready to let go. Thomas came to Clara's farm twice that month, not to press, not to ask for an answer. He came because they had agreed to talk. And he talked, and more importantly, and this was the thing Elizabeth watched for, the thing that told her more than any word he said, he listened. He asked her about the school. He listened to what she told him, not with the polite attention of a man waiting for his turn, but with the focused stillness of someone genuinely interested in what she was saying. He asked follow-up questions. He remembered what she'd said the visit before and referenced it. He was learning. She could see him learning in real time. And it was not the smooth performance of a man who had decided to seem changed. It was the slightly effortful, slightly awkward business of a man who was actually changing, which looked considerably less graceful and was considerably more convincing. He made mistakes. The second visit, he said something about the school's funding structure that revealed he'd been thinking of it, primarily in terms of how it reflected on the Whitaker name. And she called him on it directly, and he went quiet and then said, You're right, that was the old way of thinking, I'm sorry. No justification. No pivot. Just the acknowledgement, and then a genuine question about what she actually needed for the school to stand on its own. After he left that second time, Clara came out of the kitchen with 2 cups of tea and said, He's trying. I know, Elizabeth said, that might be enough. It might not be. Clara handed her a cup. You'll know when you know. I always read the last page first, Elizabeth said. Almost to her satire. What? Nothing. She drank her tea. Just something I've been thinking about. The school became real in October. Aldous Pratt stepped aside graciously with evident relief. The relief of a man who had been doing a job beyond his capacity and had been too principled to admit it, and Elizabeth Monroe Whitaker became the administrator of the Harlow County Common School. which served 43 children from the poorer families of the county, and which had been limping along on irregular county funding and the goodwill of its 2 underpaid teachers for the better part of a decade. She reorganized the funding structure in the first 2 weeks. She wrote to the county and secured a formal quarterly appropriation that was twice what the school had been receiving. On the grounds carefully documented that the return on educational investment to the county's agricultural labor pool made it a sound economic decision. Which was true, and also happened to be the argument that would work on the men who controlled the county purse. She then wrote separately to 4 of the wealthiest landowners in the county, including Thomas, laying out a private subscription model for supplemental funding. Thomas subscribed without negotiating the amount. He subscribed for exactly what she asked. Harlan Forsythe subscribed for half, after some back and forth that Elizabeth conducted with perfect patience and zero concession. Martha Gideon subscribed what she could, which was less money than the landowners, and worth more to Elizabeth because Martha had given it personally, out of her own shop earnings, because she believed in it. Elizabeth hired a 3rd teacher, a young woman from Richmond named Catherine Hall, who had been educated at a Quaker school and had opinions about pedagogy that Elizabeth found genuinely interesting and was prepared to argue for, which immediately made Elizabeth like her. She set up a lending library inside the school building. 23 volumes to start, sourced from her own collection, and donations she had solicited by letter from 3 Harlow County families who had books they weren't using. She was, for the first time in a very long time, building something that was entirely hers. The feeling of it was different from what she had expected. She had expected it to feel like relief, like setting down a weight she'd been carrying too long. And it did feel like that partly, but it also felt like something that had been very small inside her, very carefully contained, opening into a larger space. It felt like the particular warmth of doing work that was chosen freely by a person acting in her own name. She had not understood, before she left Whitaker Hall, how much of her energy had gone into doing excellent work inside other people's categories. How much of her intelligence had been bent toward goals that were not her own. She understood it now, with the understanding that comes from contrast. And she was not going to forget it. The twist came in the 2nd week of October. And it came from a direction no one had expected. Aldridge Cutter, the Richmond attorney who had filed the fraudulent land claim and whose conduct had been referred to the Bar Association, came to Harlow. He came not to fight, not to contest the findings, but to cooperate. He came to the county clerk's office and submitted a sworn statement that detailed, with the specificity of a man trying very hard to limit his own professional damage, exactly who had hired him and what he had been told. Reginald Forsythe had not been the only party. The second name in Cutter's statement was one that made the county clerk go very still and send immediately for Magistrate Dunbar. It was Edmund Hargrove, the same Edmund Hargrove whose family had been disputing the Whitaker boundary for 2 years. The same Edmund Hargrove who had, it now emerged, not just contested the Whitaker land, but had been coordinating with Forsythe to destabilize multiple landholdings along the eastern ridge, including the small farms of the families Elizabeth had defended with the long-term goal of acquiring a consolidated tract that would increase his own property by several hundred acres. Dunbar sent for Thomas. Thomas came to the courthouse and read Cutter's statement and sat with it for a long time. Then he looked at Dunbar and said, "My wife found the survey record that broke this open. I want that in the official record. Her name, her work. I want Harlow County to know who actually stopped this." Dunbar looked at him. "That's an unusual request, Mr. Whitaker." It's an accurate one," Thomas said. Dunbar added it to the record. Elizabeth found out when Thomas came to Clara's farm that same afternoon, arriving unannounced, which he had not done before. Clara answered the door and looked at him with the measuring expression, and then let him in without comment, which was its own kind of verdict. Elizabeth came in from the back of the house and found him standing in the kitchen. She could read his face now, a little she had been learning it again. or learning it for the first time properly, and what she saw was not the careful composure of the Thomas she had lived with for 15 years. It was something more open, something that looked like a man bringing news he thought she had a right to hear directly from him. He told her about Cutter's statement. He told her about Hargrove. He told her what he had asked Dunbar to put in the record. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You didn't have to do that." "I know," he said. "It will make things complicated with the Hargrove case." "If I'm named in the record, it becomes Elizabeth." He said it quietly. "You found it. You built the case that Dunbar needed. You sat in that courthouse and laid out the law for a man twice your age who had been running that office for 20 years, and you were right about every single piece of it." He paused. "I spent 15 years taking what you built and standing in it. I'm not going to do that anymore. Not with this. Not with anything." She looked at him. "All right," she said softly. The kitchen was very still. Clara, from some other part of the house, chose this moment to begin doing something loudly with pots, which was so transparent that Elizabeth almost smiled. "Stay for supper," she said to Thomas, "if you want to." He looked at her. Something in his face shifted, careful, trying not to make too much of it, trying to hold whatever this was without gripping it too hard. "I'd like that," he said. "If it's no trouble." "It's no trouble," she said. He stayed for supper. He stayed until the evening had gone fully dark and the candles were burning low on Clara's table. And the three of them talked, all three of them, which was something that had never happened before, Thomas and Elizabeth's marriage. Because Thomas had never been in a room with Clara long enough to discover that she was worth talking to. He discovered it that evening. Clara Whitfield, at 62, had opinions about property law, about county politics, about the state of Virginia's approach to public education, and about the correct way to put up green beans for the winter. And she delivered all of them with equal conviction and no apology. Thomas, initially cautious, found himself drawn in, and eventually found himself disagreeing with her about the county funding mechanism, which prompted a debate that lasted 40 minutes and that neither of them won. Elizabeth watched it happen from across the table and felt something settle in her chest. Not resolution, not forgiveness, not yet, not fully. But something that had the shape of a possible future. When Thomas finally put on his coat to leave, Clara walked him to the door with the air of a woman who had rendered a decision and was prepared to live with it. "You'll do better," she said to him at the door. "Not a question." He looked at her. "Intending isn't doing," she said. "But it's a start." She opened the door. "Good night, Thomas Whitaker." "Good night, Mrs. Whitfield," he said. And then, with the slight awkwardness of a man trying a new thing, "Thank you. For this evening." Clara looked at him steadily. "Thank Elizabeth," she said. "She's the one who invited you." He looked past Clara to where Elizabeth stood in the kitchen doorway. And for a moment the look on his face was simply unguarded, no management. No performance, no careful reserve. Just a man looking at the person he had failed to see for 15 years. Seeing her now, and understanding the weight of both things at once. "Thank you," he said to Elizabeth. "Good night, Thomas," she said. He left. The door closed. Clara turned back into the kitchen and picked up the remaining dishes from the table. "Well," she said. "Well," Elizabeth agreed. "You going to keep making him wait much longer?" Elizabeth considered the question honestly. "A little longer," she said. Why, she thought about it. "Because I want to go back when I'm ready," she said. "Not when I'm convinced. Not when I'm persuaded, when I'm ready. When it's mine." She picked up the last cup from the table. "There's a difference." Clara looked at her. "You've changed," she said. "It wasn't a criticism. I hope so," Elizabeth said. "I've been working at it." October deepened. The foliage turned across the Virginia hills, and the Harlow County Common School opened its reorganized term with 3 teachers. 47 enrolled students, 4 more than Elizabeth had counted on. referred by families who had heard something had changed, and a small lending library that Catherine Hall had already begun cataloging with the systematic enthusiasm of a woman who had found exactly the right place for her particular energies. The Hargrove Forsyth matter moved through the legal system with the deliberate pace that legal matters always move at, which is to say slowly, and with a great many documents, and with occasional developments that required Elizabeth's attention. She gave it that attention from her desk at the school, which was also her own desk, in her own office, with her name written on the door in Catherine Hall's careful hand. E. Monroe Whitaker, administrator. She had asked for Monroe first. She had thought about it and asked for both. It felt like an accurate account of who she was. Thomas came to see the school on a Thursday afternoon in late October. The first time he had come, he knocked at the office door with the same careful hesitation he had shown up at Clara's farm with that very first Saturday. And Elizabeth called him in. And he stood in the small office and looked at the desk and the books and the window that looked out onto the schoolroom, where 30 children were bending over slates, and Catherine Hall's voice carried through the partition wall, explaining long division with the patient clarity of someone who genuinely loved arithmetic. "It's real," Thomas said. "It's real," Elizabeth agreed. He looked at her, at the desk, at her name on the door, at the room that was hers. "Are you happy?" he said. He asked it the way she had asked him the question that started everything simply, directly, meaning it. She thought about it with the care it deserved. "I'm becoming happy," she said. "I think that's more accurate." "That's good," he said. Yes. That's what I wanted to hear." She looked at him steadily. "Thomas, I want to come home," she said. "Not yet. But soon." She held his gaze. "I want to come home to something different. To the things I asked for." He was very still. "He's standing right in front of you," he said, trying. "I know he is," she said. "I'm watching him." A pause. "I'm almost ready to trust it." He nodded. He did not push. He turned his hat in his hands the way he'd been doing since the summer. The unconscious tell of a man who was feeling things he was still learning to carry. "I'll be there," he said. "When you're ready, I'll be there." She looked at him for a moment longer, at this man who had broken something precious with his honesty and was trying now, imperfectly and earnestly, to understand what it would take to be worthy of it being rebuilt, and she thought about the last page of the book. She still did not know the ending. She had walked into this without reading ahead, which was not something she was accustomed to, and some mornings it still frightened her. But she was beginning to believe carefully, with his open, the way she believed things, now that the ending might be worth reaching. "I know you will," she said. He left. She turned back to her desk, to the account books and the school correspondence, and the work that was hers. And outside in the schoolroom, Catherine Hall's voice moved on to fractions. And somewhere in the building, 47 children were learning things that no one could take from them. Elizabeth Monroe Whitaker picked up her pen and got back to work. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in the first week of November. And it was not from Thomas. It was from Harriet Voss in Richmond, the widow Elizabeth had corresponded with through the summer. The woman who knew people in the legal community and was not afraid to make inquiries. The letter was 3 pages long and written in Harriet's characteristic style, which was precise and slightly breathless, the style of a woman who always had more to say than time allowed. Elizabeth read it at her desk in the school office, with the sound of Catherine Hall's morning lessons coming through the partition wall, and by the second page she had gone very still. Harriet had been making inquiries, as promised. What she had found went considerably further than the Forsyth-Hargrove matter. The consolidated land scheme that Cutter's statement had outlined was not, it turned out, limited to Harlow County. The same pattern manufactured title disputes, creative readings of ambiguous land grants, coordinated filings by the same Richmond attorney, had appeared in 3 other Virginia counties over the past 4 years. Harriet had spoken to a colleague whose husband sat on the State Land Commission, and that colleague had confirmed that the commission had been quietly investigating for the better part of a year without enough consolidated evidence to act. What Elizabeth had put together in Harlow County, the survey records, the documented timeline, the Bar Association referral, was exactly the kind of specific, verified, county-level evidence the commission needed to move the investigation forward. Harriet wanted to know whether Elizabeth would be willing to present her findings to the Land Commission. In Richmond, formally, Elizabeth set the letter down on her desk. She sat with it for a long moment. Catherine Hall's voice moved through the partition, patient and clear, explaining something about the American states to a classroom of children who were learning, one lesson at a time, that the world was larger than Harlow County. Elizabeth picked up her pen and began to write her reply. She said yes. She told Thomas that evening. He had taken to coming by the school on Thursdays, not every Thursday. Not with the regularity that would have felt like pressure, but often enough that it had become a known thing. A point of contact between them that was not Clara's farm and was not Whitaker Hall, was neutral ground that was also, increasingly, her ground, which made it the right kind of neutral. He would bring the week's correspondence that required her attention. She still handled certain estate matters, by choice now rather than by default, because she was good at them, and because she had decided that doing the work she was good at was as being taken for granted. So long as she controlled the terms, and they would sit in the school office and work through it together and talk. The talking had become, gradually, and then substantially, real, not managed, not the careful circulation of two people orbiting a subject without touching it. Real conversation, the kind that surprised both of them sometimes with where it went. He had told her 2 Thursdays prior about his father, about growing up in a house where his father's approval was the organizing principle of every decision Thomas made, and where love was demonstrated through provision and never through words, and where showing feeling was considered a kind of weakness that a man of standing could not afford. He had told it without self-justification, had told it. In fact, with the clear-eyed recognition of a man who had decided that understanding the source of a problem was not the same as excusing it. Elizabeth had listened. She had not absolved him, but she had understood, in a new way, the particular shape of what she had been dealing with all those years. Not a man who chose not to love her, but a man who had been raised without a language for it, and who had not understood, until it was almost too late, that the lack of language was costing him the most important thing in his life. Understanding was not the same as forgiveness. She knew that. But it changed the texture of things. It made the path forward something she could see rather than simply hope for. She told him about Harriet's letter. She told him about the Land Commission invitation, and what it would require, and what she intended to do. He listened the way he had been learning to listen, without interrupting, without the reflexive impulse to manage or redirect, with the actual focused attention of a person hearing something that mattered. When she finished, he said, "When do you need to go to Richmond?" "Harriet thinks the commission could convene within 3 weeks. If I can confirm my availability." "Do you need me there?" She looked at him carefully. "Why would I need you there?" "You might not need me," he said. "I'm asking whether you want me there. As a witness. As someone who was present for the Harlow County proceedings and can speak to what you found." A pause. "Or just there, if that would be useful." Elizabeth considered it. The old instinct was to say no, to handle it herself, to keep her work cleanly separate from his name and his standing, to prove that she could do it alone. The instinct was not wrong exactly, but she had been examining it lately and finding that it had 2 layers. The outer layer was genuine independence, which was real and worth protecting. The inner layer was something older and more fearful, the habit of a woman who had learned that asking for things left her vulnerable to not getting them, and that it was safer not to ask. She was tired of the inner layer. "Yes," she said. "I'd like you there." Something shifted in his face, not triumph. Nothing so coarse as that. Relief, genuine and unguarded. "Then I'll come," he said. The question of her returning to Whitaker Hall had been sitting between them for 3 weeks without being directly addressed, which was itself a kind of address. Both of them knew it was coming. Neither of them had forced it to the surface, and Elizabeth thought that was right, that some things needed to find their own moment rather than being managed into one. The moment found them on a Thursday evening in mid-November, when the first real cold of the season had come into Virginia, and the school building held its warmth against it, and the last of the daylight was going by 4 o'clock. Thomas had been going through the estate accounts, with her the Eastern Ridge parcel. Now that the Hargrove matter was formally in the courts, needed some decisions made about its use in the interim. And Elizabeth had thoughts about it that Thomas had, genuinely and without condescension, wanted to hear. They had been working for an hour and a half and had reached something like a plan. And then the work was done, and neither of them made a move to end the evening. And the school office was quiet around them. Thomas said, "I've been thinking about what you said, about coming home." Elizabeth waited. "I've been thinking about what that would look like," he said. "What it would need to look like. The things you asked for the account, the partnership in decisions, the school, none of those are conditional. Those are yours regardless. I want you to know that." He paused. "I also want you to know that I've had some conversations with Mrs. Porter and with Joseph, and with the rest of the household, because I thought they deserve to understand that what's been happening here isn't just a dispute between husband and wife. That the person who managed that house and that land for 15 years deserved to have her work acknowledged. By me, to the people who saw it." Elizabeth was very still. "You told the staff," she said. "I told them that I had failed to recognize the full extent of what you'd built," he said. "That it was my failure, not yours. That if they had questions about whether things would be different when you came back, the answer was yes. A beat, if you come back." She looked at him across the desk that was hers, in the office with her name on the door, in the school that was hers, and she thought about everything that had happened since a summer night in Virginia, when she had packed one small bag and walked 11 miles in the moonlight and stopped waiting for something she should have demanded or released years ago. She had released it, and in releasing it she had found something she had not known was there herself, clearly, without the shape of someone else's expectations pressing in from every side. She did not want to give that up. She was not going to give that up. But she was beginning to believe with the careful, open-eyed belief of a woman who had read the last page of enough books to know that good endings were possible, that she didn't have to. That what was waiting for her at Whitaker Hall, if she chose to go back, was not the life she had left. It was something different. Something that had not existed before she had left, because it could only be built in the space that leaving had created. "I want to come home for Christmas," she said. Thomas looked at her. He did not speak. "Not because it's the right time on a calendar," she said. "Because I'm ready. I've done what I needed to do here. The school is running. The Richmond presentation is arranged. I know who I am separate from that house and that estate, and separate from you. And I am not going to forget it." She met his eyes. "I'm coming back because I choose to, because I want to. Not because I've run out of other options, or because Harlow County expects it, or because it's the practical thing." A pause. "Do you understand the difference?" "Yes," he said. He said it without hesitation, and she believed him. "And Thomas," her voice was steady and clear, "if it goes back to what it was, if by spring I find that the man I'm living with is the same man I left in August, I will leave again. And the second time I won't come back." "I know," he said. "I need you to actually know it, not to say it." He held her gaze. "I know it," he said. "And I need you to know that I'm not asking you back, because the house doesn't run right without you. I'm not asking because of what you do. I'm asking because I want to know you. Because I have spent the last 3 months learning what that means and understanding how much I missed. And I want the chance to not miss it anymore." He paused. "That is the only reason that matters to me now." Elizabeth looked at him for a long time. The school was quiet around them. Outside, the November dark had come down fully over Harlow County. And somewhere out there, the Cooper family and the Tremaines and old Samuel Whitfield of the South Road were sitting on their land. Clear and uncontested, and 47 children would come through the school door in the morning. And Catherine Hall's arithmetic lessons would continue. And the lending library would have 3 new volumes next week, because Martha Gideon had found them at the bottom of a storage chest and brought them by without being asked. Elizabeth Monroe Whitaker had built all of that. In 4 months, from a farm on the edge of the county, without her husband's name or his standing or his 100 acres behind her. She had built it because she was good at building things. And because she had stopped being afraid of building things that were hers. And because she had looked at her own life clearly for the first time in 15 years and decided it was worth taking seriously. She was not giving any of that back, not one piece of it. But she was ready to bring it home. "All right," she said. Christmas. The Richmond presentation came first. They went together on a Wednesday in the last week of November, on roads that had gone cold and hard with the first frosts. Elizabeth had her documents. She had the certified survey records, the indexed files, the careful timeline of the Harlow County case that she had prepared over 3 days with the thoroughness she brought to everything. She had never presented to an official state body before. She had written to them, had corresponded with clerks and commissioners and attorneys, had navigated the particular bureaucratic landscape of Virginia's legal institutions through letters and proxies and the careful management of information. But standing in front of a room of men because it was a room of men, all of them, 6 members of the State Land Commission plus their clerk, plus 2 additional attorneys, and speaking directly. That was something else. Thomas sat in the observers' chairs behind her. He had offered, on the ride to Richmond, to speak on her behalf if the commission seemed reluctant to hear a woman directly. She had told him, pleasantly and firmly, that if the commission was reluctant to hear her, they were going to have to say so out loud, which she expected would give at least several of them pause. She had been right about that. The commission chairman, a man named Aldrich Porter, no relation to Mrs. Porter the cook, though Elizabeth noted the coincidence privately, had looked up when she approached the table and said, with the automatic doubtfulness of a man in his position, in 1816, "Mrs. Whitaker, we expected your husband to present these findings." "My husband witnessed the Harlow County proceedings," Elizabeth said, setting her documents on the table. "I conducted them. I'll be presenting." She smiled at him with the particular smile she had developed over years of similar moments, pleasant, unhurried, absolutely immovable. We begin as a pause in the room. One of the commissioners, younger than the others, with the look of a man who had recently enough been a student to still find evidence more interesting than protocol, leaned forward slightly in his chair. Chairman Porter looked at the documents on the table. He looked at Elizabeth. He looked at Thomas in the observers' chairs. Thomas looked back at him with the expression of a man who had nothing to add. "Begin," Porter said. She spoke for 40 minutes. She walked them through the pattern, the manufactured claims, the ambiguous land grant language, the strategic timing of filings designed to hit before property owners could mount a defense, the way the scheme had moved across 4 counties without triggering a consolidated response because each county had treated it as its own isolated matter. She showed them the 1,791 survey record. She showed them the comparative timeline across counties that demonstrated the coordination. She showed them Cutter's sworn statement. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then the younger commissioner said, "Mrs. Whitaker, The cross-county comparison. How did you develop this? Correspondence, she said. I wrote to the county clerks in Albemarle, Orange, and Culpeper requesting copies of land filings from the past 5 years involving the same legal mechanism. They provided them. The pattern is in the documents, page 14. The comparative table. He found faith. He studied it. This is thorough. I find it's worth being thorough, she said. When people's land is at stake. Chairman Porter cleared his throat. The commission will need time to review. Of course, Elizabeth said. I've left you a complete indexed copy of all materials. My correspondence address is on the cover. She began to gather her own copies. If there are follow-up questions, I'm available. She shook Porter's hand. She shook the younger commissioner's hand. She walked back through the room to where Thomas was standing. He had risen when she turned, and he held her coat for her, which was the unconscious gesture of a man who had been raised to do it, and which she accepted without comment, though she noted it. They walked out of the building into the cold Richmond air, and Thomas said nothing for a moment, and then he said, "You were the best person in that room." "I was the most prepared person in that room," she said. "It's not the same thing." "It's close enough," he said. She almost smiled. "Thank you for coming. Thank you for letting me," he said. The State Land Commission formally opened its investigation into the coordinated title fraud scheme on the 1st of December. The announcement named the Harlow County case as the evidentiary foundation for the investigation. Elizabeth Monroe Whitaker was named as the individual whose research had provided the basis for the commission's action. Her name, in the official record of the state of Virginia. Martha Gideon put the announcement in her shop window. Robert Gideon's mother read it 3 times. Catherine Hall read it aloud to the students of the Harlow County Common School, because she believed they should know that the woman who had built their school was also the woman whose name was in the state record. And she believed that was the kind of thing children ought to see. Old Samuel Whitfield of the South Road took his hat off when someone told him about it. He stood in the cold for a moment, bareheaded, and then he put his hat back on and went back to his work. And he did not say anything, because he did not have words for what he felt. But his daughter said later that he was different after that. Lighter. Like a man who has set down something he has been carrying for a long time and finally feels the ground solid under his feet. Elizabeth came home to Whitaker Hall on the 23rd of December. She drove herself. She had borrowed Clara's small wagon and one of her horses, and she drove the 11 miles back along the road she had walked in August moonlight. In the cold, bright December morning, with her traveling bag and several boxes of books and the account ledgers for the school, which she intended to work on over the Christmas holiday, because there was a funding question that needed resolving before the January term. Thomas came out of the house when he heard the wagon. He came to the gate and stood there, and she pulled the horse to a stop and looked at him across the distance of the yard. "You drove yourself," he said. "I did," she said. "I would have come for you, I know," she said. "I wanted to drive myself." She set the brake and climbed down. "Help me with the boxes." He came forward and took the heaviest box, the books, which were substantial, and they carried things inside together, which was practical and also felt, in the way that practical things sometimes do, like the right way to begin. Mrs. Porter appeared in the hall with the look of a woman who had been hoping for this moment for months and was determined not to make it into something excessive. "Mrs. Whitaker," she said simply, "welcome home." "Thank you." "Mrs. Porter," Elizabeth said, "it smells wonderful in here." "I've been cooking since yesterday, Mrs. Porter said, with the dignity of someone who considers this self-explanatory, and disappeared back toward the kitchen. Joseph appeared in the doorway from the back hall, hat in hand. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, and then quietly, "Good to have you back, ma'am. Good to be back." Joseph, she meant it. That evening, after supper, they sat by the fire in the sitting room, her sitting room, which Thomas had been careful, she noticed, to leave exactly as she had arranged it. Nothing moved, nothing reorganized her books and her papers and her small collection of things exactly as they had been when she left. He had left it for her, not preserved it as a shrine. Left it as a room that was waiting for its person to come back. She noticed. She did not comment, but she noticed. They talked for a long time. Not about the estate, not about the school, not about the legal proceedings or the land commission or the accumulated practical business of their lives. They talked about other things, about the kind of Christmas Thomas remembered from his childhood, which had been formal and a little cold, and the kind Elizabeth remembered from hers, which had been small and chaotic and warm. About what she had been reading, she was in the middle of a history of the early Virginia colony that Catherine Hall had recommended, and she had opinions about the author's methodology, about what he had been thinking about regarding the Eastern Ridge parcel, not as a business decision, but as a question of what the land wanted to become. At some point, she could not have said exactly when something shifted in the quality of the silence between them. It became the silence of two people who are comfortable, which is a different thing entirely from the silence of two people who have nothing to say. It was the silence of presence, of being in the same room without managing the room, without filling it or containing it. Elizabeth had forgotten that silence was possible between them. She was not sure it had ever been there before. She thought, with some certainty, that it had not. Thomas looked at her across the fire and said, "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. She said it without thinking, which meant it was true. "Are you glad to be here?" She thought about it honestly. "I'm glad I came back the way I came back," she said. "I'm glad I drove myself." She paused. "I'm glad I know what I know now. About myself. About what I'm capable of. About what I need." She looked at him. "I'm glad you learned what you learned." "So am I," he said. And then, quietly, with the particular care of a man saying something he has thought about for a long time, "I love you, Elizabeth." The room was very still. "I didn't know it," he said. "I didn't know what it was or what it required or how to speak it. That was my failure, not the feeling. The feeling was always there. I had buried it so far under everything else I thought was more important that I couldn't find it." His voice was steady and not quite easy, which was right, which was how it should sound. "I can find it now. I know what it is now, and I want you to know it." Elizabeth looked at him across the fire that had warmed this room since before either of them was born. She thought about the last page of the book. She'd spent her whole life reading it first, needing to know the ending before she could trust the beginning. She had walked into this without reading ahead, had come back to this house without knowing, not truly, whether it would be different, whether he would be different, whether she would be different enough to make it work. She knew now, not because he had said the words, because of everything before the words, the long autumn of difficult, honest conversations, the Thursday evenings at the school, the courthouse in Richmond, the boxes of books carried in from the wagon that morning, Joseph's quiet welcome, Mrs. Porter's kitchen full of warmth. Because of the fact that she was sitting in her own sitting room, in her own chair, with her own name on a school door in Harlow and in the record of the state of Virginia, and the man across the fire from her was looking at her like a person, not a function, not an asset, not a capable woman who ran things well. A person. I know you do." She held his gaze. "I love you too," she said. "I told you I did last summer. That hasn't changed." A pause. "What's changed is that I believe, for the first time, that it might be enough, that we might be enough if we keep doing this. If you keep learning and I keep being honest about what I need." She paused again. "I am not going to be small again, Thomas. I am never going to make myself small to fit inside someone else's idea of what I should be." "Not even yours," he said. "I don't want that. I want to see how large you actually are. I think I've barely started." She looked at him. Something in her chest opened and stayed open. Not with the fragile hope of a woman waiting to see if she is loved, but with the solid, grounded feeling of a woman who knows her own worth and has chosen, from that place of knowing, to be here. Then we start from here, she said. From what we both know now. From the truth even when it's hard. She paused. Especially when it's hard. From the truth, he said. Yes. The fire burned between them, and the December cold pressed at the windows of Whitaker Hall, and the night was quiet over the Virginia hills. And Elizabeth Monroe Whitaker sat in her chair in her room in her home chosen, on her terms, with her eyes open, and understood that what she had come back to was not what she had left. It was better. It was harder and more honest and considerably less comfortable, and, in every way that mattered, better. Come January, the Harlow County Common School opened its winter term with 51 students and a second lending library shelf that Martha Gideon had donated outright, insisting it was a tax on the county's good sense that the shelf hadn't been there from the start. Catherine Hall taught long division and American history and the fundamentals of reading with the focused joy of someone doing exactly what they were built for. Elizabeth Monroe Whitaker administered the school, managed the estate accounts in partnership with Thomas, corresponded with the State Land Commission as its investigation proceeded, and read the last page of a very long novel one evening in February and found, to her considerable satisfaction, that the ending was exactly right. She went back to the beginning and started from the first page, which was something she had not done in a very long time, and found that the beginning, known alongside the ending, was richer than it had seemed alone. Thomas, who had come to understand that she always read the last page first, did not ask. He simply brought her the next cup of tea and sat down beside her and read his own book. And the room was warm, and the silence between them was the best kind, the kind that does not need to be filled. The kind that belongs to two people who have finally learned to be fully present with each other. They had not fixed the past. They had not smoothed it or revised it or made it into something more palatable than it was. 15 years of a marriage that was not what it should have been, remained exactly what it had been, real and insufficient and over. What they had built in its place was something neither of them had known how to build before. Because neither of them had known, before, who they actually were when the pretense was stripped away. Thomas had not known he was a man capable of learning to love with his eyes open. Elizabeth had not known she was a woman who could build a school and present to the State Land Commission and drive herself home in a borrowed wagon and still choose, freely and without apology, to love the man who had once told her he never had. She had chosen it. Every day she chose it, not from need, not from habit, not from the absence of other options. From strength. Her own hard one, fully known. That was the difference. That was everything. Elizabeth Monroe Whitaker had walked out of her husband's house in the Virginia summer with one small bag and 11 miles of moonlit road ahead of her, and she had walked back in December with her name in the state record, and a school full of children, and the knowledge of exactly who she was. And she had never, not for a single moment, been lost. She had simply been finding her way home the long way, the honest way, the only way that was ever going to be worth arriving. And she had arrived.